This program is made possible by Atlantic Richfield Company. Energy, chemicals, minerals.
You've lived all of your life up here.
That's it. So, since there are so few people at the top of the ivory tower, I decided to stay up there.
But doesn't it make it difficult for you to understand the anguish that those who live down here have in trying to apply the
I do
ivory?
understand it because, after all, though I stay most of my time in an ivory tower, because the atmosphere is much clearer up there to think in. On the murky ground below, it's hard to think clearly, and to go up the top to think clearly. When I do come down, which I do come down every day in my family life, I meet the same difficult practical problem that anybody else does.
I mean, do you quote Aristotle to Caroline or to your children?
No, I don't. But I use them. And I use them, and I often don't solve the problems because, I mean, life is full of difficult problems. And the most difficult ones are the problems in which the balance of good and evil in either alternative is so close that no matter what you do, you have a bad solution. You have to choose a bad solution. I keep saying that's what the tragic predicament is.
Philosopher Mortimer Adler, talking about the painful conflicts in life and in a society that cherishes both liberty and equality. It's the kind of predicament he likes to put to people in his seminars at the Aspen Institute. How much equality does justice require? And are certain inequalities justified philosophically? Questions he expects all of us to answer, naturally, as we explore with Mortimer Adler the idea of equality. Mortimer Adler was born in 1902, discovered philosophy when he was a teenager, and has been a force in the intellectual life of America for over 50 years as philosopher, professor, editor, and author. His long career has been a missionary campaign to get all of us to think more critically about the important ideas that shape us. His most recent book explores a chosen few, 6 great ideas, including equality. They're not new ideas, of course. As Mark Twain said, the ancients stole all our ideas from us. But as Mortimer Adler points out, equality in particular has taken on a new significance in the 20th century. I've heard you say that of the 6 great ideas, perhaps of all the ideas you've listed over the years, equality is the most difficult. Why?
Because it involves so many distinctions and so many difficult questions, some of which I think can be answered and some of which I think are very difficult to answer indeed. I feel more tentative about some answers to the questions raised about equality than any other idea I know.
That's unusual for Mortimer Adler. Not tentative about anything.
Oh.
But equality is baffling.
That's right. Another thing about it, of course, is that it's a very recent idea. When I produced the Syntopicon in the 40s, equality was not one of the 102 ideas. And the reason why it was not is because in the great books from the 5th century BC down to the 20th century, there was very little discussion of it. The heated discussion, began in the 19th century, and it's one of the central topics of the 20th century. I would almost characterize the 20th century as the century in which equality, human equality, the equality of peoples, the equality of nations, has come to the fore as the prime question.
I would conclude from what I've heard you say that from Aristotle to Jefferson, and from Jefferson until today, we have learned more about human nature than they did in those days.
I think that's true. I think that is true.
To what extent has that affected our...
I'll tell you what I think is true. I think the blinders of prejudice have been taken from our eyes. Aristotle was prejudiced by the society which he lived. I've said many times, and I don't mind repeating it because it's a wonderful insight. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, quoting Aristotle on Some Men Are by Nature's Slaves, says, Aristotle was right, but he mistook the effect for the cause. When you look at what he's saying, Aristotle thought they were by nature slaves, when in fact they were by nurture slaves. And they were made slavish by the way they were brought up and nurtured, and he then thought that they were by nature instead of by nurture. He was deceived.
And our understanding of equality has changed over time.
The bare idea of equality hasn't changed. What we're talking about, as a matter of fact, in what sense is it factually true? This is the question, it seems to me, we've changed our minds on. In what sense is it factually true that all men, all without exception, Eskimos, Hottentots, anyone, the Australian Aborigines.
Men, women, black, white.
That's right. All, without exception, are equal. The only sense in which that can be true, only sense is they are all human beings with the same properties that the individual members of a species must have to be members of a species. That's nothing more than that.
What you're saying in 20th century terms is that society's consciousness has been raised
Right.
about a fundamental
Absolutely.
component of human nature.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Well, just let me say another point. Why did it take almost 2 centuries to discover the economic rights? When the French Revolution took place, Bill of Rights, you know, the French declared a Bill of Rights before we did even. Strikers in Paris at the time of the Revolution were put down. The 18th century had no conception of economic rights. It took till the 20th century for the first blush of interest in economic rights to take place.
See, I think that men believed women to be inferior when the Pankhursts started the suffragette movement.
They did, even as late as that. Oh, they did. They did.
What does that say? What does the use of liberty to dissent say about our understanding of equality and these great social issues?
The first great exponent of the liberation of women in direction of the equality of the sexes is John Stuart Mill. Of course, it must be admitted.
You had a remarkable wife.
Harriet Taylor.
Yeah.
Yet I believe that even if Harriet Taylor hadn't prodded him in the library, my reading of Mill is that he would have come to the same conclusion. But Plato, in the Republic, this 5th century BC, in the ideal state, says that all offices of the state shall be open alike and equally to men and women except one, General of the Army. Now, that's an extraordinary statement in the 5th century BC. And between Plato in the 5th century BC and John Stuart Mill in 1863, nothing. Not a single writer. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Percy Bysshe Shelley's father-in-law, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin's father. Godwin took the position before Mill did. But other than that.
But, you know, if you pressed a lot of people today and got them to open their hearts, I think they would still say they think women are biologically inferior, and they think non-whites are biologically inferior.
When you say biologically, the question of, you must mean strength. There's no evidence at all of female inferiority, not the slightest evidence in degree even.
I agree with that, but don't you think there is a consensus?
It's a long-standing prejudice that is going to take another century to get rid of. We made great progress. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you what the difference is. In the last 30 years, or even the last 50 years, something has happened. Women are nurtured differently. In the 19th century, they're still brought up to be wives and only wives. In England, it was not, in 1850, they had no property rights. Everything belonged to their husbands. Well, just think now, it's like Aristotle. If people are brought up in slavery and treated as slaves, they'll appear slavish. If women are brought up as inferior and treated as inferiors, they'll appear inferior.
So you come back to nurture.
Exactly.
Nurture
Nothing
meaning,
else.
nurture meaning.
The way in which the person is treated in the course of development. That's all.
In the last 40 years, we've had 2 enormous manifestations of inequality and of the view of one group of being superior over other, Hitler and the Jews, and persisting today in places like South Africa, whites and blacks. And the question is, if it is self-evident, or if it can be proven, as you attempt to prove, that people are equal, why do some people still treat other people unequally?
I want to correct you. I don't have to prove that all human beings are equal. I hold it, if Jefferson is properly understood, it is a self-evident proposition. As self-evident as the whole is greater than many of its parts. That if individuals belong to the same species, they are all equal in all having the same species-specific properties. That's as self-evident as any proposition in the world. No proof necessary.
Let's assume that. Why do people still treat people unequally?
Hitler treated the Jews unequally for a political reason. Whether he believed it or not, I don't know. He could have just as easily done it without believing it. just as easily. And in South Africa, the reason is perfectly obvious.
Economic.
Economic. If you had
Cheap labor.
if you had a white majority and a small black minority, the white majority could treat the black minority as equal.
All right, assuming again that you're correct about Jefferson, that it is self-evident, what are the equalities to which we are all entitled by virtue of being human?
I think, now we're talking about an ought proposition. First, I start with a factual proposition. All men are by nature equal, and the equality they have is a limited equality because although they all have the same human properties or traits, they have them individually in different degrees. That's clear. That's the fact. Equal and unequal. Men are equal and unequal.
But the moral prescription.
Most people think that the propositions all men are equal and human individuals are unequal are inconsistent. Not at all. They're completely consistent. Equal in having the same properties, unequal to the degree in which they have the properties, right?
But you got to define properties.
Intelligence, longevity, all their human faculties.
And we're equal because we all possess them,
right.
But we're unequal because
The degree.
In a long life spent studying equality, what do you think has been your most significant discovery or contribution?
I think it is first calling attention to the basic inequality between haves and have-nots. Have and have-not families, have and have-not nations. By the haves, I mean those who have in political power and wealth what everyone needs to lead a decent human life. The have-nots are those who are seriously deprived of what everyone needs. And then secondly, among the haves, the distinction between those who have more and those who have less, earned by contribution, earned by performance.
Let me ask you 4 simple questions. 1, should all of us share in political power?
Yes, absolutely.
2, should all of us share equally in political power?
No, of course not, because those who hold official positions in government have more responsibility and therefore must have more power to exercise it.
3rd, should all of us have the economic necessities of life?
I would say even the amenities, what is needed for a good life, all should have that.
4, should we all share equally in the economic necessities
No,
of life?
because among those who have, some should have more and some should have less according to the difference in the contributions they have made.
But I know you also believe that no one should have so much that it means there are left in the world people who are deprived.
I certainly do say that, and I think it's a fundamental point.
But there are people in the world who are deprived. How do you explain that?
Because of inequitable distributions. We have not put limits. Locke said that in the possession of wealth there must be upper limits so that everyone shall have enough.
You're going to put that question to the seminar today?
Indeed I'm going to put it as a basic question they must face. What did Jefferson mean when he said, all men, I'm not asking you this question, I'm going to answer it. What did, this is the question I'm going to answer this one because I don't think this question is even disputable, as you'll see in a moment. It's going to lead up to some questions that I think are open to wide argument.
It was at the Aspen Institute in Colorado's Rocky Mountains 30 years ago that Mortimer Adler found a compatible environment for his belief that adults ought never to stop learning, and that learning can be fun, whatever your age or station. The seminar's purpose is argument, in the best sense of that word, and through argument, insight. No one provokes a better contest than Mortimer Adler. He's sometimes criticized for ruling the room with a presumption of authority that borders on intellectual imperialism. He shrugs it off as part of a day's joy, his version of hemlock. I'm not trying to be popular, says Mortimer Adler. I'm only trying to make you think.
What did Jefferson mean when he said, all men are created equal? If he meant that all human beings have complete equality, he was a fool. If he meant that the statement about human equality is if he meant that all human beings have complete equality, that statement is not only not self-evidently true, but it's manifestly false. But Jefferson was not a fool. He meant by his statement that the equality of all human beings, all without exception, repeat that word, all is the most extraordinary word, they are all haves with respect to the traits that are common to all members of the human species. And having those traits, they are all equally human, all equally persons, but with respect to those same traits, one individual human being may have more and another less. Now then, here are the questions. Question 1, does Jefferson's truth, properly understood when Jefferson is not made a fool, does Jefferson's truth call upon society, a society, any society, to establish equality of opportunity for all and nothing more? Or does it call for establishing, does Jefferson's truth properly understood call upon a society to establish equality of opportunity for all and nothing more? The operative words are nothing more. The alternative is, or does it call for establishing equality of conditions or results as well as equality of opportunity? Who, in answering to the first question, advocates, in the light of Jefferson's truth, that a society should promote or try to establish equality of opportunity and nothing more? Please. Are you alone, Jeremy, in that?
Apparently I'm alone.
All right. Let me see what the rules of this little game are. You will take your position, and then your friends will try to interrogate you and see if they disagree with you, they're going to try to persuade you to give it up. See? You've got to hold it rationally now, not emotionally, right? Okay, proceed.
Well, it seems to me that any other position gets you into all sorts of troubles. I mean, I understand the emotional animus for believing that society can promote more than equal opportunity, but I don't see in the end any way of doing that in practice, which does not get the society into all kinds of trouble. I mean, an example, it seems to me, of an extreme example where a society has gone beyond that is the China under Mao, in which it was decided that everybody would have the equality of opportunity to essentially work on collective farms, and that all of the
irony should be omitted.
And that in that way succeeded in destroying almost the entire intellectual life of China. Now, perhaps I haven't said anything which constitutes a defense of the position, but I have to hear who my attackers are and what they have to say.
Attackers? Bob, you're sitting next to him. Maybe you can talk to him personally.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to change his views or even want to, because I think sitting here reviewing the questions, I'm under certain conditions could actually join Jeremy.
I was wondering whether you wouldn't or not.
Because I think if you call equal opportunity a total equal opportunity, you could then also say it's equal conditions. And if you include equal conditions, which really is a part of equal opportunity by many standards, then I would join Jeremy. And certainly, if you said that you had to guarantee equal results, I know I'd join Jeremy.
Well,
because you did answer, you did put on results, but I think you said or.
Please take my.
If you use or, it's okay.
Please take my judgment that you have joined Jeremy.
Thank you. Nice to be aboard.
To both Bob and Jeremy, I say there's so many inequities, and you can talk about equal opportunity, but actually you look out there and see that there are certain people that we foreclose on. There are opportunities, but it's impossible for them to achieve those opportunities unless you believe, like I do, that Jefferson had a broader scope in mind and wanted to provide a broader platform so that you wouldn't foreclose on certain people.
Well, either you had equal opportunities or you don't. I mean, in other words, the premise of Mortimer's question is that you had equal opportunities, which means every individual in the society has the equal opportunity to become anything and to go as far. Now,
and that would include
But,
social, economic, and political.
Please.
The opportunity is therefore, when you say equality of opportunity, doesn't mean a thing unless you've defined the conditions. You see, because it's a baseline from which you start. You know, that's the whole point. And we have a proverb in Ghana that 5 fingers, although they belong to the same hand, are not of the same length, of the same functions. So obviously all the fingers have the same opportunity to tie a knot, for instance. But there is a proverb that you cannot tie a decent knot without a thumb.
Around our seminar, I think there are 11 men and 3 women. Gross inequality, I would say. But on the other hand, we'll cope somehow, won't we?
Wouldn't you agree, Robin, that we're not completely equal, but we are equal in a limited way. We all are human, and some of us are stronger and some of us are weaker. Some can run faster, some can run slower.
I think it should be amended to ought to be equal. All men ought to be equal.
Oh, no.
The dilemma is, what do we do about women in science in universities? That's a dilemma. Now, it is a fact, in my field and in the more abstract fields, there have been rather few women physicists and mathematicians. Now, more women are entering those fields, and the question is, do we in the universities owe them more than we owe the comparable male physicists who are entering the profession? In other words, are they to be given only the same equality of opportunity as their men contemporaries, or should they be given, because of some deprivation or some past discrimination, a handicap, an advantage, a handicap in the positive sense? And my position on this is that they should be given equal opportunity and nothing more. In other words, that if women want to come into the sciences in a university, both of them should have equal opportunity for the same job, for the same position, but nothing more.
May I just a moment, please? I'll come back to you just in a moment. Alex?
I think the dilemma is a really false one, because you're really begging several questions. You're begging several questions because the people who have access to physics, as a rule, are very, very limited in several societies. Certainly, if you take my country, for instance, Ghana, I mean, there was a time when women were not getting the same opportunities for education in any case, of any kind. And more men, because of the structure of society and all the various influences at work, had better opportunities. So when you have brought a number of people into the university, some are already under certain disabilities, because previously there has been a prejudice against women doing certain things. For instance, driving a car used to be felt a very, very manly thing. When you saw a woman taxi driver, this was meant to be a most unusual thing. And yet, it has been proved that several of them are much better taxi drivers than other men taxi drivers. So I think your particular example is rather unfortunate, because you're really dealing with a already restricted group. And then you are extrapolating from this a common truth which does not really apply. There were many better women physicists in certainly conditions where everybody was starting, as it were, from scratch, than those who had parents and brothers and so on, who had been used to thinking that this is the sort of thing, the motivation and so on. So I think you have to look at it in a much wider thing. And you come back to the same point about the conditions and the nature of the human individual. That's the real crux of the problem. And I don't accept the inherently sexist, although liberal, but sexism, which is implicit in what you are saying.
May I? 3 women would like to speak. Just a moment. I'm going to call on Betty Sue first, because like Alex, she's a university administrator. Right, Betty Sue?
That's right.
Proceed.
Jeremy, it seems to me that when you use equality of opportunity, as I hear you using it, you're taking it out of a historical context. You're saying, now, today, we will provide equality of opportunity. But I don't know how that could even exist without taking into account the conditions that have existed in the past.
What I'm really doing in this context is trying to discuss the merits of the affirmative action program in general, and through the affirmative action program, trying to discuss the larger question of what we owe to people in society. So I'm just starting out from a small dilemma, with which I'm familiar.
Maybe in the future, when women have not been discriminated against, say in mathematics classes in high school, then the equality of opportunity can exist only or simply in opening doors. Now, because there's not an equality of condition, that must first be established. Maybe I could just give an example.
Well, how have women been discriminated against in mathematics classes in high school?
Well, I'll give an example, my own example. I wanted to go into science. To do that, you need a mathematics background, beginning quite early. When I got up to solid geometry, the class was open to all, male and female. There was equality of opportunity. I happened to be the only female in the class, but that was still equality of opportunity I chose. However, we had to make balsa wood figures for our grade. And the only way you could make these, or the easiest way to make them, was to go into the shop. Now, the shop was closed to women. It was open to men, but it was closed to women. So in order to pass my mathematics class, in order to make those balsa wood figures, I needed to go into the shop, and I was not allowed into the shop. It was dangerous for a woman. The machines were too heavy. So I dropped the class. It was the only class I dropped in my whole high school education. When I went then to the university and was in zoology, I had a distinct disadvantage because I lacked so many mathematics classes. I had stopped at solid. So had I gone to the university in zoology 10 years ago, or this year, and been given an opportunity still to participate in those classes, I think I would be in science today. No.
Robin, I'll come back.
Well,
Robin?
as I understand Jeremy's question, the way he's posed it, and I also am interested in what Betty Sue said, and having had much the same experience working in the stock exchange, where in the time I was there in the 50s, you couldn't be a floor trader if you were a woman, so that limited some of your abilities to function. I say that now, if conditions permit that there is equal opportunity, then I think women have to take the competition out there, and they have to succeed on the basis of their competence, whether they're physicists, whether they want to work in the securities business, whether they want to be teachers or whatever. And I think this is where we must arrive at that point, where women have the equal opportunity to make it. I don't think, and I don't believe, in the case that Jeremy posed, that you're going to make concessions because they are women. You're going to go looking for women, obviously, but you're going to be very sure they qualify.
Just a moment, please. Shirley?
The question is, are the qualities, are the conditions in that institution such that she in fact has an equality of condition to men who have been in that institution before? And I say it's possible in the fullness of time to create that condition, but it does not exist now. Therefore, in order to even the race, if you will, you cannot have an even until you so reorder the institution on the interior that the conditions in fact for that woman are really equal to the conditions for a man who is entering at the same point in life.
John and then Bob. John and then Bob.
I think Jeremy's dilemma is very real, and it won't go away by talking about where we'll get to in the millennium. It is with us now. It's one of the most important social issues confronting the country, and it illustrates these issues of equality. Courts are faced with this, administrators are faced with this, legislators are in deciding whether there should be affirmative action. You want to staff a police department, entry level. You want to pick 100 policemen. And you have determined that that police department has discriminated against blacks or women or whichever minority is at issue. Now, you could make up for the prior problem Betty Sue mentioned. You could simply say, if they now need 100 people, we will give them all simply baseline qualifying tests. Take all who pass, put their names in a hat, and draw at random a number precisely equal to their proportion in the society, if you think that's relevant, or in the workforce, if you think that's relevant. So that you don't in any way worry about the fact that they didn't have the courses earlier. You could do it that way. But many would say, and I think in the present circumstances I would agree, that you ought to do more than that. You ought to actually be affirmative more than the equality. Take more of the blacks, take more of the women in the interim until you are at the point where the problem ceases to be a major social problem. Now, I don't say do that universally. I make some qualifications, and I'll suppose I'll be accused of rationalizing. But if you have at a hospital 3 vacancies for brain surgeon, and you have several applicants, and there are 3 outstandingly qualified brain surgeons who all happen to be white males, and there is a female who knows how to do the brain surgery operation but is really not very good at it, I would not apply affirmative action to that task. but to most of the tasks for which we hire people in American society, that for most of the tasks, the gradations are not that significant, and we can go ahead without significant loss of quality of job performance to take affirmative action in the short run until the problem is not nearly as pressing as it is now. Now, that's imposing an inequality for a different equality. And it's a dilemma, as Jeremy posed it. I'm perfectly willing to choose up sides on that side of it.
Coco, Rudy,
Mortimer, I have a feeling we are discussing the problem of equality in terms that were characteristic of the previous decade rather than of the decade into which we are moving. That is to say, the problem of equality is no longer a problem of choice between equality of opportunity and equality of conditions. Now, the problem is that the capacity of the US and other welfare state nations to apply opportunity or to pursue equality of opportunity is severely limited by the slowing down of the economic growth rate. The problem now has turned around, and the women and the minority groups are already feeling the impact of that.
And the youth?
And youth. That is, we are now faced with the question of the equality of burden, of the burden.
Yeah.
Who is going to pay or to carry the burden of the welfare society shrinking its basis? That is the problem. And here already, women are already becoming its victims. The minority groups, youth, are becoming the victims. Therefore, I think we should expand the range of our discussions to include opportunity of burden. Now, this is not only limited to the welfare state. It is limited to the human community as a whole.
Francis?
I'd like to raise another angle, which in a sense touches on all this. It seems to me that we have two motives for desiring equality. One is our natural instinct for justice, and one is a more empirical, pragmatic acceptance that injustices cause disturbances that will come back to endanger our own security and our own welfare. It seems to me that if one looks within a national confine over the last decade or so, we have seen disturbances resulting from inequalities which have dictated a pursuit for justice, whether, for instance, in this country on racial grounds or with respect to sexual discrimination or other minorities have been mentioned. And I would like to relate this then to the issues raised here on the international setting, that inequalities between nations, within nations, are causing disturbances which are threatening the very foundations of our society. So, that being the case, therefore, it seems to me that the issue, the dilemma raised by Jeremy, has to be looked at from 2 points of view. One is the desire to achieve justice. The other is a pragmatic realization that some groups have reacted against the injustices that have pertained for so long. And therefore, what we want is to meet that degree of their expectations or demands that will make for stability and harmony between us as groups.
Alex, if you would, I would like some light, if I can get it, on how we determine who should have more and who should have less.
Human beings cannot really quantify this particular virtue or vice. I mean, you cannot put them in the scales and say, this is the 50% or this is the 70%. And that's the whole point. I think it's a false, posing the problem in false terms.
Could I ask you, Khrushchev, at a crucial moment in the development of the Soviet state, said, Marx said, to each according to his needs, I add to each according to his contribution. Do you think Khrushchev was wrong to say that? That means giving different people different amounts of wealth in terms of their contribution. You think he's wrong?
I think Khrushchev was wrong because he was right if I'm right, then, if I'm Khrushchev, then I'm very right, because I'm determining who is making the contribution. That's the whole point. You see? That really is the whole point. Who is determining who is contributing what?
That's a good question, but the question does follow the principle. You can accept the principle and say it's insoluble in application, but do you accept the principle?
The human beings are not machines. That's the whole point.
Yes, Francis, just a moment.
There's a concept of equality that I posed earlier, and I would be interested in a reaction from you. I think I would tend to agree with you that we cannot all have exactly the same amount of money in the bank. We cannot all have exactly the same knowledge on philosophy. We cannot all have the same knowledge in law. There are just so many respects in which we cannot be identical in the sense of equality. But I would insist that in our different respects, when you add the totality of our different distinctions, I would hope that we would conclude that all of us around here are equal, even though all of us around here are not equal in different respects. I wonder whether society can devise a method whereby Jamoko, through his works of art, whereby you, through your work of philosophy, everyone, through his different respects, can contribute in such a way that in the end we can all feel we are equal. That kind of equality, I think, is a must.
Yeah,
Mr. Allen.
I'd like to raise a methodological point, and then bring it back to the particular examples we've been discussing, Mortimer. I think my difficulty, and I think that of others, in these interesting discussions which we've been having, does come back to a problem of method. One which will never be solved, where we're stating, as you and I have often done in argument, two sides of a problem which is perennial. I think you feel that if we are going to go into discussion of these deep and confusing questions, the essential thing first is to have clear and agreed ideas before we get into the realm of fact and of historical evidence. This you certainly do believe. And I as clearly believe the opposite. Since it is in fashion to make 18th century quotations this morning, allow me to quote from Bishop Butler, who once said, "Men first raise a dust and then complain they cannot see." This seems to be almost the most perfect philosophical statement I ever heard. And it led me at the age of 21 to abandon philosophy for the study of history.
See what happened to him. See what happened to him. And you see the results right now.
You see the result, as you say. And I see the result too, Mortimer, and we each recoil from the other's dilemma. But leave personal things aside, because I want to come to it seriously. You yourself said this morning, when we began, that the debate about equality only began in the 18th century.
19th almost.
Right. Fascinating. So how can you detach the discussion of the word equality from the historical circumstances in which it gave given birth? Now, I know you will say, but surely you can talk about questions like this, conscience, truth, liberty, over the ages. Yes, you can. That is one of the dimensions. But the other dimension is that the meaning continually changes. And it's that change in meaning, both in different cultures and in different historical periods, which I think we can't leave until we've got the concept clear. Because by then, we're using concepts which may no longer be in tune with the reality. And I take the case of equality as a very interesting one, I think. We started with Jefferson. That, I think, has to be seen in relation to the period of his time. We come on to the 19th century, come to the 20th century. The debates about equality, affirmative action, are something that only take place in our time. And I mustn't lose sight of the fact that there is a meaning to equality that runs through these, but it always changes. We are talking about ideas in an historical process. And my limitation upon yours, when you said, do you say that as a complete and absolute truth for all time? No, no, no. Only for now. For now, I say that. Because some other issue will then arise. There will be some other thing. Maybe by then we're so concerned about liberty, we have to say, look, we give a priority to that over equality.
I understand perfectly what you're saying. And I would just like to add the qualification that if imagine it's unimaginable, I suppose, if aiming at complete equality, we should achieve it in any society, I still would like to take the position that achieving it would produce injustice.
Long before we got there, we should see warning lights, and we'd have to have another seminar.
Robin, theoretical thinking is easy. Of all the subjects in the world, mathematics is the easiest because it's the most abstract and theoretical. When you get into the practical order, you have much more complicated and difficult problems, and the economic aspect, a sphere of the practical law, is even more complicated than the political. But in any sphere in which human beings are acting, either individually or collectively in society, there are three levels to thought. The level of the universal abstract principle. That by itself solves no problems ever, but no problems can be solved without it, that level of principles. The second level below that, as you come down toward action, is the level of general rules or policies, where the principles are adapted to the contingent circumstances of a given time and place, a given culture, differing as they do. Those two levels don't solve the problems. You can't solve them without those two levels. The third level is what in the practice is called casuistry, the application of the rules which are based upon the principles to particular cases. And it is often the case when the situation when the case is very difficult, the problem is insoluble. All I mean by that is that reasonable men, quite reasonable men, can differ in their decision about the case in the light of the same rules and policies and the same principles. Now, the error that most people make, and it makes me very impatient and very sad, is they think that because the sound rules and policies and the true principles don't solve the case, throw them away. They couldn't solve, the case wouldn't be difficult. The case wouldn't even be difficult. You wouldn't understand its difficulty if you didn't see it as difficult under the rules and under the principles. The fact that the principles and the rules and policies don't solve the case is merely the fact that the cases are so complicated. Aristotle, again, if I may cite my old friend, made the point that the rules of law, because they're written generally, don't apply perfectly to singular cases. And therefore, it's sometimes necessary for an equitable person, he has a sense of equity different from the modern English sense of equity. Equity calls upon the judge to decide what the lawgiver had in mind, which he didn't express in the rule of law in handling this case. Set the strict law aside, but settle the case in the spirit of the law, not the letter, the spirit. And that's what he's called an equitable dispensation from the law, and that's the meaning of strict justice is often injustice. To try to pull this case under the rule will often do injustice to this case, you see.
You have acknowledged that there has been a development of our understanding of human rights. Yep. You've suggested there's a possibility of our understanding more about human nature today. Might not this understanding go on? Might not human nature be more diverse than you now believe it to be?
More diverse? I suppose so, but...
Different?
By my saying we might find more, though I have some doubts about it, human diversities, I am in no way negating or taking back the fundamental common traits. See, I'm not just being a biologist, I'm being a philosopher and metaphysician. If you have a kind, which is what a species is, and you have individual members of a kind, either you're wrong about the kind, don't know what it is, or if you're right about the kind, then you know what every individual member of the kind possesses as an attribute. They can't be members of the kind without possessing those attributes. Now, if you say, at some future time, a new man will come, the Marxists believe, you see. The Marxists, a very good way to make it. The Marxists think there is no human nature, that what appears to be human nature is entirely a product of the methods of production and distribution of wealth. So in different economies, man is different. And they think when you have pure communism on Earth, a new man will come into existence. I think that's a lot of rot. Just a lot of rot.
Because?
Because man is a biological species. Has a nature determinate in itself without regard to the environment.
But I wonder if you had studied, instead of philosophy for the last 60 years, the tribes of Central Africa, you might not think differently about human nature.
I haven't visited the tribes of Central Africa, but being a man of fairly wide reading, I've read the anthropological literature. I find nothing in it at all that changes my notion that all human beings are human.
And you don't think that human nature is affected by cultural behavior?
I think that all the cultural overlays, like nurtural overlays, are highly superficial. I really resent the effort on the part of the culturalists and the nationalists and the ethnicists to insist that their differences are fundamental. They're all superficial, all highly superficial. Nature is solid underneath it.
Nature?
Human nature.
Human nature. Yeah. All right, assuming that it is, then, what are the equalities to which we all are universally entitled by the virtue of being human?
Well, To answer that question, I must give you the one maxim of justice, which I think is indisputable, that controls my thinking. It's a single sentence, a prescriptive proposition in ought. Equals ought or should be treated equally. All equals should be treated equally. And unequals should be treated unequally in proportion to their inequality.
I don't understand that.
When I say that all men are equal, forget about their inequality now. I'm saying their equality, in all the respects in which they have the same human traits, calls for equal treatment politically and economically. They are equals and they should be treated equally politically and economically. What do I mean by that? I mean that they should all have what any human being has a right to in terms of the needs that are inherent in his human nature. All men have an equal right to freedom. All men have an equal right to the political status of citizenship with suffrage. All men have an equal right to that amount of wealth, not too much, but that amount of wealth without which no human being can lead a decent human life. Everyone should have what anyone needs to lead a decent human life. Very simple.
So you're treating equals as equals,
That's
you're
right.
treating humans as humans.
That's right.
But what do you mean about unequals being
Now
treated
then,
unequally?
Now you're getting to the hard part. I would say that I do not think that justice recommends that a society, in order to be just, should attempt to establish a complete equality of conditions. And the reason why I don't think so is because I don't think human beings are completely equal. I think they're unequal as well as equal. And in this connection, I want to call your attention to two kinds of inequality. Not their inequality in intelligence or their inherent attainments, their native endowments, nor even their inequality in attainments. Because in the political and economic arenas, the spheres of political and economic life, what counts is the inequality in performance.
But by my understanding of your position, you would say then we ought not to aim for equality of condition politically.
Oh, I beg your pardon. On the contrary. On the contrary. I couldn't be... I don't see why you say that.
Because you said a minute ago, I don't think we should aim for equality of condition.
No. We should aim at an equality of conditions that is a limited equality of conditions as follows. All human beings should be politically equal at the baseline as citizens with the power that citizens have conferred upon them. And those in public office should have more power. I say, look, remember my statement. Limited equality exists where all are haves, and some of the haves have more, and some of the haves have less. In other words, it's equality combined with inequality.
Politically, those haves, we all have.
We all
have a vote, but those who hold office have more power than we
Now,
do.
it's illicit and illegitimate when private citizens have more power than those who hold office.
Now let's come to the trickier question
Economic?
of economics.
Oh, that's tricky. That's tricky. Now, I say, by natural right, because men are obliged to pursue happiness, they need what it takes to pursue it well. And what it takes is a certain amount of wealth. I'm going to call that minimal degree a sufficient amount. Use the word sufficient. A sufficient amount for living a decent human life. Those who have it are haves. Anyone below that line who has less than that sufficient amount is a have-not.
Anybody who has less wealth
That
than
is
is
needed
necessary
for a good human life.
For a good human life is a have-not.
Now, a society which has established economic equality is a society in which all families and individuals are haves and there are no have-nots.
On the question of contribution, that anybody who contributes more has the right to earn more and to keep it, as you say, who's going to determine the value of the contribution?
The only answer I have to that difficult question, and I'm sorry it's such a poor answer, but I don't know of any other, is supply them in an absolutely free market, which doesn't exist. But if an absolutely free market existed, supply and demand would determine it.
I thought you would have said philosophically, justice should decide it.
But no. The question is, you have to let the free market, the action of the free market through supply and demand, answer the question of the justice distribution.
Are you saying that the free market acts justly?
I'm saying that's the best measure you can get.
But we know the history of libertarian philosophy. When the free market was unregulated, it left victims in its wake. to the tens of thousands.
I think, by the way, curiously enough, you need regulation to make a free market. For example, you can't have monopolies. I mean, Adam Smith was a free market economist, was against monopolies, against trusts. Now, the reason for that is because it's an, shall I say, an impersonal determination. You can't put the determination in the hands of any human being.
Is there any limit to how much they ought to earn?
Can I change that question slightly and say, though advocating limited economic equality, which means that all should be haves, and I think justice requires that some should have more and some less, I think there's a limit to how much more the have-more should have.
Who should make that determination?
I can give you the principle. I don't know how to tell you who should make the principle is no one should have so much that others are deprived of that minimum sufficiency which everyone should have.
Let me come back to your formation. Equals should be treated equally, and unequals unequally in proportion to their inequality.
Right.
I could agree to that on one level and come to a different conclusion.
Right.
Take the simplest case of the handicapped. The handicapped is unequal to the person who's not handicapped. I think the handicapped should be treated unequally by being given a benefit that does not go to the person who is not handicapped.
Charity and compassion, not justice.
I think that's justice. The handicapped deserves, as a human being, what is necessary.
It deserves an act of love on your part, not an act of
Is
justice.
entitled to, as a human being, to what is essential.
But everyone,
Right.
handicapped, even the disabled, totally unable to work, should have what any human being needs to do. On the lower level now, that everyone, remember our proposition? Every human being should have what any human being, in the amount of sufficient wealth, what any human being needs to lead a good life.
Should our society aim at a condition
I think it should aim at that equality of conditions within the limit that I said, that everyone should have the same conditions to which all have a right. See? If all have a right to education or to schooling, which I think they all have a right to, since they all have a right to it because schooling is an accessory, an indispensable instrumental means to acquiring knowledge, and they all have a natural right to know. Then, almost at birth, I'm going to be an ideal now, the conditions antecedent to their going to school should be equal. Here's one child who's brought up in a ghetto home, in a broken home, in an impoverished home. When they go to school at 4 or 6, they're not going equally to school.
It is conceivable that you could create an equal race, but it's not very feasible, is it?
But you see, the conservatives, in our discussion in the seminar, one thing was very unclear. William Graham Sumner, who was a social Darwinist, took the position that equality of opportunity was an equality before the law, and equality of opportunity was enough, and you didn't have to think about antecedent equality of conditions. And his point was, you start the race of life at the baseline, and let everyone run according to their unequal conditions and unequal powers, and he ends up by saying, and the devil take the hindmost. Now that's the extreme conservative position. Give them equality of opportunity, and the devil take the hindmost.
The libertarian.
That's the extreme libertarian. That's the extreme libertarian.
But I thought I've heard you say on other occasions that we shouldn't try to promote more than equality of opportunity.
No, oh no. I've always said, on the contrary. I always said we should always promote a limited equality of conditions, by which I mean they should all be halves politically, they should all be halves economically. And I stopped being an egalitarian at that point, who would say they should all have equal amounts of power, all have equal amounts of wealth. That would be complete equality. They should all be halves, but I think justice requires, in terms of contributions and services and performances, however it's determined, that some shall have more and some shall have less, though I then add the qualification or limitation that none shall have so much that anyone else is deprived of what everyone should have.
And your conclusion is that justice requires inequalities.
Inequality as well as equalities, that's precisely it, and limited liberty. That's why I keep saying so insistently that of these three ideas, liberty and equality and justice, justice is the sovereign and governing idea.
Philosophically, applying this proposition of justice, philosophically, take the cry of women equal pay for equal work.
100% right.
On what philosophical basis?
Each according to his, if two persons, one male and one female, holding exactly the same jobs in a corporation, performing exactly the same services, one gets paid more than the other because one is a male and the other is a female, that's unfair, unjust distribution.
And justice requires?
Equal pay for equal work.
So
treat equals equally and unequals unequally.
So in your philosophy, egalitarianism is to be scorned as much as libertarianism.
Absolutely.
What about those nations in the world that are caught up now in trying to pursue equality at the same time they pursue national development, or nations like ours that are trying to pursue equality and increase national security?
Can't do it. They will fail.
Which effort will fail?
Equality.
And what will happen?
Well, I think if it fails signally enough and severely enough, people will rebel. I tell you why I think so. Equality came in the picture in the 20th century, the cry for it. Then no one's going to give up now. The have-not nations want to be equal with the haves. In our country, the have-not part of our population wants to be equal with the haves. No have-not will long endure being have-not. And they're quite right. They shouldn't.
Because?
Because they have a right to being have. They have a natural, unalienable right to have. And not be the deprived have-not.
And that right comes from?
The human nature.
If society does try to go beyond equality of opportunity to equality of condition, of what values would such an all-out effort be destructive?
Well, the libertarian thinks that the effort of the government, of a liberal government, to create equality of conditions will definitely infringe free enterprise.
So it's liberty versus equality there.
But the question is, if the free enterprise, to be free, has to be unlimited, and can interfere with an equality of conditions, which is what justice requires, then the limitation on free enterprise is justified. In other words, the libertarian wants too much liberty, and too much liberty will interfere, too much free enterprise will interfere with establishing equality of conditions. And the egalitarian wants so much equality, more than his justice requires, that he does infringe upon liberty.
So the process of society becomes a balancing act, doesn't it?
That's right. And justice is the balancing force.
Mortimer Adler. In our next and final episode, we will conclude this series of 6 great ideas with the governing idea of society, the idea of justice. I'm Bill Moyers.
For a transcript of this program, send $3 to Ideas, Post Office Box 900, New York, New York, 10101. This program was made possible by Atlantic Richfield Company, Energy, Chemicals, Minerals.